I think it's really important that we define what debt is and define specifically good debt and bad debt. What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining us on the Make Your Money Matter show. Okay, so many of you heard of the Mandela Effect, which is the effect refers to a phenomenon in which a large mass of people believes that an event occurred when it actually did not, like false memories, hence the name. People actually believed, if you don't know the Mandela Effect, people actually believed that the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, died in prison in the 1980s, but actually he was alive until 2013. So there are other popular examples of those reserved for those wanting to go down the YouTube rabbit hole, and please go for it. But for today's purposes, for the purposes of this show, I'm going to talk about another social phenomenon called the Diderot Effect. But before we do, be sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode of the Make Your Money Matter show. Let's get into it. So the famous French philosopher, a guy named Denis Diderot, he lived nearly his entire life in poverty, and it all changed in 1765. Diderot was 52 years old at the time, and his daughter was about to be married. But because he lived in poverty, he actually could not afford or provide a proper wedding. Now, despite his lack of wealth, for anyone who has heard the name Diderot before, other than in this phenomenon we're going to talk about, Diderot's name was well known because he was the co-founder and writer of what we know today as the encyclopedia. Let that sink in for a second. So he was a prominent figure, no doubt, during the Age of Enlightenment. Now, when Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, heard of Diderot's financial troubles, she offered to buy his library from him for £1,000, which today is approximately a little over $50,000. Suddenly, Diderot, who had lived his entire life in poverty, had actually money to spare after paying for his daughter's wedding. So shortly after this lucky sale, Diderot acquired a new scarlet robe. And that, my friends, is when everything went wrong. Diderot's scarlet robe, this thing was gorgeous. It was beautiful. In fact, you can look this up. It was written about. It was gorgeous. In fact, he immediately noticed how beautiful this piece was and how out of place it seemed when surrounded by the rest of his very common possessions at that point. In his words, there was no more coordination, no more unity, and no more beauty between his robe and the rest of his items. The philosopher soon felt the urge to buy some new things to match the beauty of his robe. He replaced his old rug with a new rug from Damascus. He decorated his home beautifully with sculptures and even, just like then, like now, a better kitchen table. I don't know about you, my wife and I are currently looking for a new kitchen table, and it is impossible to find, but I digress. He bought a new mirror, in fact, to place above the mantle, and his straw chair that he had during his life of poverty was relegated to the antechamber and now is replaced with a leather chair. These reactive purchases is what we know today as something called the Diderot Effect. The Diderot Effect states this: the obtaining of a new possession often creates a spiral of consumption, which leads you to acquire more new things. As a result, we end up with what? Buying things that our previous selves never needed to feel happy or fulfilled. I bring this story up and this effect because it explains a lot that I think we all have asked of ourselves. I don't know about you, but I'm going to speak for myself. Why do we want things? Why do I want things I actually don't need? Is it marketing? What is it? Like you, I've fallen victim to this. I know you have too. And as an example for me, 2 years ago, I bought a new truck and I hadn't bought a new car in a while. And after sorting through all the purchases, all the additional things when you buy a car nowadays that go with it, whether it's the premium tire package and all those little ancillary things that go inside the car. And at some point at the end point, I was like, wait, what did I just do? I didn't need those things. I didn't have those things in my last car, but I felt with the new car, they should go in there. And at no point did I feel that any of the previously mentioned items were worth actually purchasing. And yet, after getting this shiny new car, I found myself falling into the same consumption spiral that Diderot did. And why am I bringing up Diderot Effect? Because here at One Capital Management, we see constantly, every day, that we as human beings fall into wanting things that we may not actually need. And in doing so, we can actually cause something that actually is the bad side of this, which is debt. And so today I want to talk about how we manage debt of any amount. First and foremost, when we start this topic, I think it's really important that we define what debt is and define specifically good debt and bad debt. These are not definitions that I'm going to go through that serve for every purpose, but in my view, good debt has three things with it. It's low interest, it's for an asset, and it usually has some sort of tax benefit associated with it. So the one that comes to mind, there's actually two that come to mind, is mortgages and school loans. So the one particular I'm going to focus on here is mortgages. They're low interest, they are for an asset, the house, and the real estate itself, the interest on Schedule A deductions, whether you're itemizing, you can check with your tax advisor on this, you can get tax deductions for it. So in the world of debt or leverage, there are such things, believe it or not, that good debt can do for you. This is something that if you're watch a Dave Ramsey, for example, who I love, this is the one where I differ. I understand that arbitrage is a big tool that you can use if you use it right. Now, another example, as I mentioned, is student loans. Again, it's typically lower interest depending on your income. It can be deductible depending on your income, and it's for an asset, the asset being you. So those are two examples of what I'll call good debt. On the other side of things, let's talk about bad debt. And again, this is not something we want to dwell on here, but I want to talk about that debt because it would be debt that would be unsecured, meaning it's not backed by an asset. Typically, it carries a higher interest rate and really has no tax ramifications or deductions or benefits because of it. And you probably know where I'm going with this. It's typically things like credit card debts. These tend to be higher interest, no real tax benefits or deductions from them, and they're not really tied to an asset. This category I bring up because it typically falls into what the Diderot Effect would describe as things we may think we want, but don't necessarily need. The original purpose for a credit card or credit was to have liquidity if certain events may happen that maybe you don't have enough cash on hand to support. Maybe it's big medical events or home repairs or things that just have to happen that you don't have the cash to do. And that's why they were originally invented. But inevitably, when you put that in someone's hands, life will go by and the Diderot effect will happen where you buy something like, let's say you were reorganizing your living room and you bought a new couch. Well, now all of a sudden you realize that the picture frames or the mirrors or the rugs in that room don't go with it. So we find ourselves going to Home Goods or Target. Oh my gosh, Home Goods. I spent more time at Home Goods in the 8 years of being a homeowner myself, being married to my wife. I'm pretty sure I have a subscription to Home Goods, or maybe it's Target. Everyone, all the guys out there know Target is a big one for us too on the weekends. And buying up these items to match the newness level of your living room, it's a real thing. I'm bringing it up because it's actually an effect. We know this, we talk about it commonly with our friends, but it's actually an effect. It's an effect from a great example in the 1700s of Denis Diderot. So we fall into this trap of where we're all of a sudden we start to use money we really don't have. And that, my friends, is how we actually get into what I'll call the debt trap. We've all been there. Debt isn't something that some people have. It's something that most people have. So check these stats out. This is from debt.org, facts and figures about American debt. More than 189 million Americans have credit cards. By the way, in quick stats, that's over half of the US population. The average credit card holder has at least 4 cards, and that stat to me, amongst all of these stats I'm gonna go through, actually was the most crazy. Now, on average, each household with a credit card carries $8,398 in revolving credit card debt. The total US consumer debt is at about 13.8% or $6 trillion. Now, that number, that last number I just mentioned, includes mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards, as well as student loans. So put that in context for a second. Now, I'm pointing this out largely because you're not alone. I really want to share in this conversation around the reality of debt. I think the biggest thing around when it comes to a topic like we're going to talk about today is essentially taking the lid off. Let's all talk about it. We all have debt. We've all had debt at one point. And I want to share to all clients listening and watching and all of our subscribers here listening and watching that you're not alone. Putting equity in a house or putting a roof over your family's head, that's the good debt. It's also one of those things, debt, where we look at life, and life is especially for those in California, New York, or higher cost states, we know that in those states, it's expensive to live. We live here, we know it. Here at One Capital Management, our headquarters here is in California. So if you're listening across the nation, as I mentioned, whether it's New York or in expensive states, you know that debt is a part of life sometimes. And by the way, speaking of California for a quick second, the average Californian owns $334,925 in mortgage debt, which, by the way, that dollar amount surpasses every other state in the country. The national average, speaking of the rest of the country, is right around $190,000. And on the consumer debt side, for a second, the average Californian carries around $10,000, $496 of credit card balance, which is roughly, from the balance earlier, $2,000 more than the national average. So again, I'm expressing this because obviously here at One Capital Management, we're headquartered here in California. We work with a lot of clients here in California. We have clients across the nation. It's an expensive place to live, and debt can be a part of our lives. Now, debt means different things to different people. In my nearly 20 years of being a financial advisor, I have talked to clients in discovery meetings, plenty of clients I've talked to who've had $2,000 of debt and can't sleep at night. I've also got others that carry $80,000 in debt or lines of credit for their businesses or other items and sleep perfectly fine. So contextualizing your debt in relation to your overall wealth management is a large part of what any good advisor should do with you and for you. And here at One Capital Management, that's what we strive to do. It's something your financial advisor really should be doing, okay? Because your situation and your tolerance level may be different from someone else. So let's get to the main question today. How do we manage the debt that we have? Let's start with some basics here first. First and foremost, know how much you owe. That's number one. Make a list of your debt, including the creditors, the total amount of it that you owe, and then the monthly payments. Figure out your debt list first. Having all the debts in front of you will allow you to see the bigger picture and, I guess, stay aware of your overall complete debt picture. Next, number two, I would say, is pay your bills on time. I know that sounds like super simple, but that's one of the biggest items when it comes to affecting your credit score. Late payments, they all make it harder to pay off your debt. So you ultimately have to pay the payment and then a late fee. So make sure to pay that on time. All right, let's get into some strategy here. So those are some two one-offs that I wanted to mention that I know may sound rudimentary, but is important. Now, after we understand who we owe and how much we owe, we want to decide which debts to pay off first. And this is something I talk about quite honestly. And I don't care if you're watching or listening here and you have multiple zeros behind your name or 1 0 behind the name. I've talked to clients across the wealth spectrum, and this question actually comes up. So I want to kind of bring to mind here how the billionaire mindset thinks. So paying off credit card debt first is often the best strategy. Why? It's because it typically has the higher interest rates on those types of debts. Remember, I mentioned earlier, good debt versus bad debt. Now, unsecured debt like credit cards typically carries higher, straightforward, just interest. So all of your credit cards, the one with the highest interest rate, usually should get the priority on repayment because it's costing the most money. Make sense? Now, I'll be honest, most people actually think that they want to attack the larger balance first, but it's not really right for me to say which one makes sense to you. That's where you sit with your advisor. But numerically and financially speaking, to be fair, the overall goal here is to make sure you pay your debt in what I call the rental charge. If you think about it, when you have debt and an interest rate, it's a rental fee, isn't it? You're borrowing money from someone. That's a rental of that money. So it's a cost of doing business, whatever that business is in your life. You want to look at how much money you're paying relative to the balance, and the ones with the higher interest, the higher rental rates, typically carry the most risk and really the most cost of carry. You've probably heard that term before, the cost of carry for the debt. So you want to focus on those first. Now, for those listening and watching, you might have heard of the snowball method. Dave Ramsey talks about this a lot, someone who I massively respect, and he's talked about this in terms of getting out of debt. And then remember, his strategy and a lot of others like him are no debt ever, right? And again, I tend to differ there because I do think debt can be used in the right ways. Again, you're focusing on more the good debt versus the bad debt. But the snowball method is a debt reduction strategy in which you pay off the bills in order of the smallest to largest, regardless of interest rates, okay? So I understand the philosophy and I'm okay with it if you stick to it. And the snowball method, along with an interest rate function, meaning you still have the snowball effect of putting all your debts in order of the payoffs. And then once you pay off one, you roll that payment to the other and you create, again, a snowball effect. That's the mentality behind it. I like focusing on interest rates as well because again, they're still the highest cost of carry. So in my mind, you can't ignore those. So some of our clients that have done this method before, and we've designed plans around this, in fact, for our clients. I just did one recently who had a mortgage, credit cards, student loans, and an RV that the family had for their trips. And they had those 4 or 5 different interest rates and debts. They all had either unsecured, no deductions to them. They were higher interest, some were double digits. And then the amortization or the term was also different. Some were pay off over 3 years, 5 years, and then 20 years. So what we did was we actually put a financial calculator together, something our wealth analyst team here at One Capital Management built, which I think is a great design for any of our clients. But in those, we focus on the higher interest rates and we still did the snowball effect. So I think you can do both. This is kind of a combination of what I call the higher snowball effect. You're focusing on high interest rates and the snowball effect of taking the debt you're paying off and then using those to pay off the ones in a few years. And we rolled that payment into the other payments. And that's how you create this effect. And it minimized, if you look at the overall scale, it minimized the amount of years that they were effectively paying this overall debt. And the overall, it was all over the same time period. They were actually minimizing the amount of interest they were paying. So the topics of debt or interest rates are very important to us as advisors. I think a lot of private wealth advisors in particular tend to focus on, oh, that's more debt reduction strategies. But the reality is, I want to be very clear about something. Wealth management and financial advisory and investment management has to take a look at your whole picture. It's like a balance sheet for a company. You have your profit and loss statement, which is essentially your cash flow. Then you have your balance sheet. That's your assets and your debts. Debts are a part of your planning. And debts can be like quicksand to an overall investment strategy. That's why they play hand in hand. If you're paying debt, let's say of 8% between all of your debts, and that's an average, let's say, and you have between credit cards, mortgages, car payments, and we took the weighted average of all that debt and it was 8%. And your rate of return that you're making on your portfolio is only doing 6%. You can see real quickly that you are actually paying a net negative 2%. You're earning 6, but you're paying 8. So you're actually net losing 2%. Your balance sheet is somewhat out of whack in that regard. We want to combine those two to make sure that we understand what your weighted average is, your weighted average of all your debt. Most people don't know what they have. They'll look at these 3 or 4 debts they have going on and they're like, well, you know, I got an 8%, I got a 3% on mortgage, I got a 15% on a credit card. But you look at all the debts and you do what's called the weighted average. You want to make sure that you combine those together to figure out what your cost of carry is. Because again, I mentioned the Diderot effect in the start of the show on purpose. We are going to get things. That's a part of life. I'm not saying you're not supposed to live life. And a part of getting things as human beings, we're going to want to expand what we think we need, although we may not. We will get that new car and you'll get that new tire package. And for those that avoid that, kudos, because it's hard to do. Behaviors here are key. And I think sometimes we have to work within the context of the root that's causing this. And if you're continually getting back into debt, you want to make sure you bring that up with your advisor, because I can sit here and describe to you all of the debt reduction strategies, but if we're just putting a Band-Aid on an open wound, don't bother. I mean, I'm not trying to say just continue going into debt, but you really want to take care of the disease, not just focus on the symptom. I'm not trying to be dramatic here on it being a disease, but for some it is, to be fair. And I think any good advisor can help by putting money aside as a liquidity account and building on those savings as a debt reduction strategy. So we can start managing that debt or using some of those things in the future. And there's a lot of ways around that. And tying your investment returns to your outflow or your distribution rate or your debt cost has a lot to do with integration. And there's a lot of people doing that right now with mortgages and refinancing. I mean, right before this recent Fed interest rate increase, there was a lot of important strategies to lower the cost of carry by refinancing your debt. But if you don't put all those together, it just becomes an uncoordinated plan that's going on and really not cohesive for an overall retirement plan. So starting at the very basics, the very elementary levels here, you want to make sure you know who you owe and how much you owe. And then understanding the debt reduction strategies to make sure, from again, the simplest form, you're always making your payments on time, because again, that's the number one thing that affects your credit score. I'm sure that's not shocking to anyone listening here, but whatever debt reduction strategy you have, and the one thing that I like doing here is focusing again on the higher interest rate debts, as well as creating that snowball effect. So the snowball effect, right, it doesn't consider really interest rates necessarily. It's just kind of all the debt and paying them down, the largest balances first, and kind of paying them off, right? The higher interest rate, when you combine those two and you really understand your weighted average, you can then not only pay your debt off in the same snowball effect, but you can also be able to avoid, if you learn the whole scale, you can avoid the amount of money you're paying on that debt. Because to develop a strategy to pay down your debt is one of the key ways in developing and maintaining and building an overall investment plan. All right, it's time to answer your questions. If you have a question or a topic you'd like me to address here on the show, you can leave a comment or a question in the comment section below. Or if it's something you want to talk about more on a one-on-one or more personal, you can go to our About page on this channel and send us an email. We'll always keep the questions I read here anonymous, so you never have to worry about your name being shared or used, but we'd love to hear from you. Today's question actually was perfect. Should I focus on paying my debt off first or investing first? This, my friends, is an art, not a science question, in my opinion. You can have a lot of different strategies and discussions around this. If you line up 10 advisors, they might give you 10 different answers here. I'm going to answer to you on, well, first and foremost, I'll say this. It's a case-by-case basis. It's a very specialized answer in how you would answer that. It depends on the debt amounts, how many debts, are the debts secured or unsecured. Really, I'd focus on the lower interest rate. So I'm going to talk about and answer this question in what I'll call arbitrage. If you have the biggest part is like mortgages, for example, right? That's usually the largest, and the stats show it's one of the largest debts many Americans have is your mortgage. And usually those rates fall into the good camp, right? Low interest, typically deductible, and for or against an asset being the home. So if you have a 3.5 or 4% mortgage rate that really if you itemize, after your Schedule A deductions of itemizing that for the tax benefits might actually be lower than that. I'll typically say this, if you have extra cash and you're okay with the payment from a cash flow basis, if you can make north of the 3.5 or 4% that you're paying on the mortgage, then I would say continue with your investing strategy, because arbitrage or the delta or the difference is on your side. If you're going to go and pay 4%, but you can go historically maintain on an average 6%, you're making 2%. The inverse of that is if you have debt, and especially the weighted average, where it becomes 8, 10, 12, 15%, maybe more of your debt's focused on credit cards, we may want to focus on paying that down. And here's why. You can run the investment strategy out all day long, but if you're earning less than 15%, as an example or hypothetical, then you're really not managing or earning or investing above what you're paying on the debt. So I think the answer really lies here is it depends on the amount of debt, but also really the actual cost of carry, the actual cost of the debt. If it's a debt that is manageable from an arbitrage perspective, and you can historically and on a risk tolerance that suits your needs and your investment plan make more than the debt cost, then I think investing is your camp. But if you are paying a higher cost of carry or debt or interest rate, then no matter what you invest, you might not be able to make enough to pay the cost of carry. So you might want to focus on debt reduction strategies first. Now, again, if you have a question or comment you'd like me to read here, you want to leave it in the comment section or email us in the About page on our channel. You're happy to do so. And remember, any of the answers we're giving here on the show really should be sussed out with your own advisor. And again, if you'd like our help, you can reach out to us. And if you want to learn more about us, you can visit our website at onecapital.com, or you can scan the QR code on the screen here with your smartphone to get you there. You can also call or text us. We want to help. Listen, there's no pressure here. We don't treat people like a number. Any advisor, any good advisor shouldn't. In fact, we here at One Capital Management, we value our relationships. It's the lifeblood of what we do. So click, call, or text us today. And if you're not following us on social media, you should be. We're sharing great information on all of our social media platforms. And as I often say when I end the show here, if you like the show, share it with someone you like. And I guess if you don't like the show, share it with someone you don't like. But until next time, always remember to make your money matter.